I grew up in a overcrowded environment. I grew up in a part of Philadelphia where there'd been a massive amount of building of Levittown-like developments, and everywhere I went, it was awash with people. So I went to a high school with 6,000 students, 1,800 people in my graduating class. It was so crowded in the hallways between classes, you could hardly get from one to the other. And I really wanted to have a different experience. So I decided to go to a small college, to Swarthmore. And when I was there, I quickly realized how unprepared I was for the rigor of that kind of environment. Because one of the byproducts of going to such a big impersonal school was not very demanding academically. And so in my first 2 years, I managed to rack up 8 incomplete courses, which I think might have been a mid-Atlantic record at the time. And in response to ending up in this dilemma, you'd have to get permission from the professor to get an incomplete. You'd have to fill out a form, and then you'd have to go see a wizened older dean who had a made-up title of associate provost, but who was basically the shepherd to lost young souls. And he took me under wing, and I came to see him so many times over those 2-year periods. We forged a close relationship. And I later learned that he's the person who kept Robert Putnam from dropping out of college as well. When he ran into a real impasse in his life. So I saw firsthand the value of mentoring, and you know, he really never gave me advice. He really just gave me acceptance. Invited me to his house for dinner with his family and on camping trips. And you know, I later discovered that, you know, just hundreds and hundreds of people had that same experience. And when I went back to my 45th reunion several weeks ago, there's now a painting of him that hangs right after the entrance to the main building of the college. And so it just gave me, you know, it was really interesting because his role really was to be a mentor, even though, you know, they had to give him an academic sounding title. So I saw very, very early in my career the power of mentoring and also of cross-generational bonds. And I've taken that with me every step of the way.
Yeah. And Marc, what a powerful story of your experience of, I love the 8 incompletes. Welcome to A Life Worth Working, a podcast about how we get to the soul of work.
We're your hosts, Michelle Weiss and Dana Allen Walsh. I'm a writer on the future of education and work, and Dana is the senior pastor of a progressive church.
And as always, we love hearing your comments, questions, and thoughts. So please know you can email us anytime at hello@alifeworthworking.com.
And please make sure you subscribe to our show, give it all the stars, and share it with your friends and loved ones who may be searching for more meaning in their work lives.
In this episode, we chat with Marc Freedman, founder and co-CEO of CoGenerate, and founding faculty director of the Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative, Yale Eli Fellows. He is one of the nation's leading experts on our multi-generational future and is the originator of the idea of the encore career, or the idea of linking second acts to the greater good. So, Marc, you have experience being a recipient of mentorship. And then tell us about how your career comes into being of doing 3 decades of mentorship work in a multi-generational setting.
I went to work for an organization that was set up to create new educational and social programs for low-income kids. And I went there at the age of 25, so I was a young person focused on young people. At that time, the field was so heavily dominated by quantitative sociologists, economists, who saw the importance of relationships as being a challenge for the research, this intangible, confounding aspect that, needed to be ignored. And there was even talk in the education field of teacher-proof curricula at that point. So that messy human elephant was messing up all of these research projects. But if you talk to young people, they always wanted to talk about a person, a barber, a coach, a neighbor who had taken them under wing. And so I was much more taken with what I was hearing from the young people than from these researchers, and the opportunity arose to do a study of Big Brothers Big Sisters, which had been around for a century but had never been evaluated. And it turns out there were 30,000 kids waiting on the waiting list, and they were waiting about 18 months. So we took 1,000 kids, and 500 of them got Big Sisters and Big Brothers, and the others waited for 18 months. And we just wanted to see what the difference was. And it was shocking. There was a 33% difference in violent behavior, a 46% difference in drug and alcohol use, a 50% difference in school truancy. And it was really shocking because there really was very little going on other than the bonds. There wasn't a curriculum or a program. So we, assumed we'd made some kind of mistake, but there was no mistake. And, without believing this was a panacea, it underscored the power of creating relationships. And at the same time, because there were so many kids on the waiting list, raised this question of where are the human beings to do the things that only human beings could do. And most of the people being recruited for mentoring programs then were people who were busy with their own kids. And we found that it took 10 to 12 hours a month of real focus and attention to produce those results. So success was a lot about showing up. So that also raised the question, where is the segment of society which has time along with numbers? And it seemed abundantly clear that there were a lot of people who were the ages of Gil Stott who had taken me under wing. And so that got me thinking about older people. And now, 3 decades later, I realize this connection is about so much more than time and numbers, that there's a developmental fit. It's like the needs and the assets of older and younger generations fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So, so I started in a kind of 2-dimensional way. And ever since I've been learning that there are additional dimensions.
And what does the work look like for you now, Marc? I know you just talked about wrapping up a course through Yale. So can you describe that?
It's a great time to talk about that because I'm in a very reflective mood. So last week I finished the first cohort of the Yale Experienced Leaders Initiative, the Yale Eli Fellows, which I served as faculty director for and really have been working on for 3 years. And so that was an emotional moment. And at the same time, right in the middle, AARP held a celebration for the 30th anniversary of Experience Corps, which included a panel with my co-founder, Linda Fried, who's the dean of the Mailman School at Columbia, the public health school there. And so it was a chance to reflect on that program as well. And now, everything's, I'm thinking, what's the last 30 years been about? I didn't think I would start anything again. I'm 67 now, and both of those experiences drive home something that I think is very much in line with the theme of your podcast, which is that a lot of stuff was unanticipated, random, required adaptation. And it's funny because in this conversation with Linda Fried, who's a wonderful scientist, a physician, she looked back at the same experience with Experience Corps and saw it all being rooted in scientific principles and unfolding in this, linear and compelling way, which I'm sure is true. And all I can think of are all the missteps and sidesteps and unanticipated developments. So, for example, we started the program out with a kind of 1,000 flowers blooming approach. These older people were doing all kinds of things to help the kids in Philadelphia. One of the schools, a retired mailman brought a mailbox into the school and started a writing program where kids wrote letters to each other, put them in the mailbox, and then he would go and they would be deputized as junior letter carriers. Things like that stood out for me. And then then the Clinton administration decided all new money in service was going to go towards reading by the third grade. And suddenly we became a literacy program. It turns out the program was a really good literacy program. Research by Johns Hopkins and by WashU showed extraordinary effects on reading by the third grade. But that was never, at least in my mind, an intention. So, and similarly with the Eli Fellows, the Fellows themselves were remarkable co-creators. So many, we spent all this time coming up with a model, and they very quickly challenged important aspects of the model, added on, started teaching each other. And, I guess I really believe in the twists and turns, not just of careers, but people want to look back and see this kind of rational linear picture, but in fact, things are much messier.
I love that word, to be co-creators, and that invitation into collaboration, to have an idea, but to truly trust the work of the process and the others who are joining you.
Yes. And, it's interesting. Another parallel between these two efforts is that they did become all about relationship. The Experience Fair program was designed to build these relationships between older and younger people, but the older people worked in teams of 10 to 15. They formed bonds that were like workplace ties. There were young AmeriCorps Vistas who were in their 20s who came into the program. Those bonds between the older and younger, in every direction, these relationships are radiating. And what I learned from this more recent Yale Eli experience is that 80% of the program for these fellows was each other. As a faculty member, you're thinking 80% is about those fabulous readings you're assigning and these, insightful lectures. That was marginal. It was really a container around which these deep bonds formed.
I imagine then, Marc, you have some thoughts and opinions about our current state right now, where there's so much technology involved, and you have folks like Mark Zuckerberg over at Meta talking about AI companions. Curious how you're thinking about the role of mentorship in this really rapidly evolving environment we're in.
To go with random nature of how I tend to see things, and this is probably sidestepping your question because I'm not really sure of my direct answer, but a drawback of the Eli program is that it's a hybrid program. So people came together at the beginning and the end in person in New Haven, but in the middle, it was all on Zoom. And the great, positive realization is that people were able to form these deep connections through this medium of technology. On the other hand, there were none of the kind of random encounters with young people that have defined the programs at Harvard and Chicago and Stanford and Notre Dame, where these older people are taking classes with undergraduates and graduate students. And it meant that any kinds of cross-generational bonds, which I'm so focused on, had to be made in more kind of mechanical and deliberate ways. So anyway, how's that for sidestepping?
That's totally fine. Well, actually, that leads me to another question. I'm curious if you could maybe talk about one of the most powerful or impactful bonds you have with someone who is younger than you, who, I imagine you've been taking people under your wing like Gil Stott did to you or for you. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'll make it a two-part answer and give you the honest answer in the first part, which is that throughout my life, at key junctures, it seemed like an older person would appear and take me under wing and provide invaluable assistance. One of the closest bonds was with John Gardner, who I co-founded Experience Corps with, who had the original Experience Corps name, who was in his 80s at the time. And it seems like as I've gotten older, I've just looked for older and older people. And because it's been such a rewarding experience. So I still find myself, at 67 looking for older mentors. So I had to actually step back and say, wait a minute, I need to be doing what Gil Stott and John Gardner and some of these other wonderful humans did for me. And so I've had to make that a more conscious effort, because I think instinctively I'm just somebody who has always sought out older people, and that actually continues. But it's happening in some different ways. One is a couple of years ago, I decided that it was time. I didn't want to be the old guy who hung on to the job beyond the appropriate time. Not that we have any examples of that in public life today.
Not at all.
But and so I approached my absolutely phenomenal colleague, Eunice Lynn Nichols, and asked her if she would be my successor. And that's something that I had been thinking all along. She's 20 years younger than I am and had started working on these issues when she was in her 20s, ran the Experience Corps program in San Francisco. And so I thought I was, bestowing this great mantle on Eunice, and she turned me down flat. And what she said to me, really from the heart, we've always been wonderful colleagues. She did not want to work like I had worked all of those years, and sacrificed family and, been away all the time and in a constant state of anxiety about fundraising and board meetings. And it wasn't a life that she aspired to. She had 2 teenage boys at the time. But to my surprise, she came back with a counteroffer, which is doing the job together. And I realized that we, as an organization, as we shifted from older people for younger people to older and younger people together with older people with younger people, that also involved actually modeling the co-generational precept of the organization. It's been one of the best experiences of my life, being able to share the job. I'm not sure that either one of us is any less busy, but it not being such a solo undertaking. Yeah. I learned so much from Eunice. I've become a big leader of a big proponent of co-generational co-leadership. And there's so much evidence in the research that Arthur Brooks has written about fluid and crystallized intelligence and how they complement each other. There's a famous BMW study that looked at assembly lines with older and younger workers. What they found is that the assembly line with older workers exclusively was very good in terms of mistakes, but not so good in terms of speed. The one with younger workers exclusively was quite fast but error prone, and the mix line was both fast and error free. So I think of it more as a metaphor, but I do think that there's extraordinary opportunity in that combination.
Marc, I love your own creativity and openness to doing a new thing, and to taking on not that necessarily that mentorship, maybe power over somebody, but really power with, and that co-generational leadership. That's incredibly powerful. So I'm thinking about people in their work careers, and often as people imagine a change, a pivot, maybe an entirely different field of work or a different role in their company, they're looking for a mentor. And I'm curious if you can describe for us what makes a good mentor relationship and how one seeks out a mentor.
It's interesting. As you're describing that question, I was thinking about a program we ran and just spun off in the past year, the Encore Fellows program. And it's basically a gap year for grown-ups, an internship where people primarily from the corporate world are moving into NGOs, and in ways that blend their accumulated expertise with new challenges. So if you were working on marketing at Cisco and you go to the Boys and Girls Club of Silicon Valley, you might be working on marketing there, but it's in a whole different context. And I think that blend is really important. And we conceive that program as a kind of pathway to purpose from the beginning for older people who were kind of all dressed up with no place to go. But what we discovered is over and over again, these mentor-like relationships form between the Encore Fellows and the executive directors of these NGOs. And what was so interesting about them is that unlike the board members of the organization, the Encore Fellow had no kind of power governance responsibility. Unlike the staff in the organization, they didn't report to the executive director in that kind of formal way. And so they really were, kind of walking alongside the executive director. And then, I think one of the most important aspects of mentoring and of what we saw with the Encore Fellows program is humility on the part of the older person. They had accumulated experience and wisdom, but a real respect for the limits of that. And the other lesson that really goes back to the Big Brothers Big Sisters study is, there's that line, I think it's a Woody Allen line, 90% of success in life is showing up. It really is persistence and consistency that is so important. So these Encore Fellows, they were there, a few days a week, week in and week out for a year. Those Big Brothers and Big Sisters were showing up every week for an extended period of time. And I think it's critical for building trust, and you can't rush it. It's, mentoring is like, baking a souffle. If you do try to expedite things, if you try to be strategic, it often collapses.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's such an important reminder that time and patience are required for real relationship building. It's not something we can schedule, with 5-point questions to just make it happen.
You've been studying this, you've been researching it, you've been writing about this work, you've been a social entrepreneur, and you have deep, deep curiosity about just the space of mentorship. What do you feel like you're still trying to figure out about relationships and mentorship?
Well, I think that in the shift to cogeneration and the emphasis on collaboration, it's much more a kind of co-mentoring. And I think I'm really interested in what older and younger people can do together, especially in all the crises that face now. And to go to what you were saying, Dana, the trust and those bonds are so important. But how do you come together on equal footing? Oftentimes there's a power dynamic, there's a wealth issue. That I did a course at the Modern Elder Academy a couple of years ago that included people from their 20s through their 80s, and then almost equal distributions in every age decade along the way. And wonderful people. They really liked each other, got along. Many of them are, cross-generational lines are still in contact. But the wealth divide was so dramatic. One of the 20-somethings was a single mom living in the Midwest, doing community organizing, trying to put food on the table. One of the older people had been an early employee at Apple. And, it was it was awkward in many ways because the inequalities of society, which are often kind of cordoned off into different quarters and correlate in many ways with age, were front and center. And so I think these issues of power, how do you really come together in ways that feel balanced and equitable, and where the expertise of both groups, the wisdom of both groups are. I think of one of my favorite lines we did a webinar a couple years ago with Angela Glover Blackwell from Policy Link and Eric Liu from Citizens University. And one of the things they talked about and both agreed on was that, one of the great opportunities of society was to bring together the wisdom of the young and the curiosity of the old. And I think, getting outside of some of the stereotypes of what each group brings is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Does it, you had mentioned that so much of your path to date has felt like, a lot of twists and turns and things you just didn't expect. Does it still feel like a kind of calling to you, all of this work?
It does. And I don't know if either of you read Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act. It's quite good. He's this remarkable music producer, and it's a book about what he learned about creativity. It's not a memoir in that sense. And one of the things he argues is that from all of these musicians that he's worked with, that they oftentimes didn't know where the idea came from. It was he was convinced that they were just really good at listening to the zeitgeist, and he makes the case, which I found really compelling. It's interesting, there'll be these artistic movements that happen in different parts of the world or scientific breakthroughs with people who really didn't work together at all, but they were all tuned into the sort of the ideas of the times. And he argues that if you don't listen to what the universe is trying to tell you, it moves on to somebody else. So that produces a lot of it. But I've really felt like, for me, there's just a frequency that I've been trying to tune into. And it's, Wendell Berry, the poet, has this wonderful line. He said that he was interviewed on NPR a couple of years ago, and he said that we live in an age of divorce where things that are supposed to go together are split apart, and all we can do is put two things together, not all things, two things. And I think that that's what, I've been tuning into for a long time, is that there's this opportunity to put the old and the young together at a moment when those are two of the dominant, a quarter of the population's under 20 and a quarter of the population's over 60 right now. We're in the most age diverse era in human history. And in a way, even with all things bouncing around and unanticipated, I think I've been trying to put two things together for the whole time, but in different ways.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I love Wendell Berry. Yeah.
Yes. Anytime you get to invoke Wendell Berry.
There you go. Marc, I'm curious about, I love that word frequency, of kind of what frequency are you tapping into? And when you look ahead at the next 5 years of your career, what does growth look like for you in this life stage?
Well, again, I think that this is going to be one of those sidestepping moments, but the issue that, substantively, the issue that I'm obsessed with is age segregation, because it's a kind of segregation that I think people are not aware of, that it's easy to feel is just natural, like the oxygen in the air, when in fact it's utterly against the grain of all of human history, with the exception of the last century or so. And, out of, desire for greater efficiencies of scale, and we put young people into one set of institutions and middle people into another, and older people into senior centers and retirement communities and nursing homes and lifelong learning programs, all which we invented with the highest ideals and aspirations. But we end up with this society where it's even in the moment of age diversity, it's very hard to have sustained contact across generational lines, especially beyond families, traditional families. So I really, how could we reimagine work, school, communities, care in ways that brought generations together in a mutually beneficial fashion so I'm really interested in that, take housing as an example. We build all of these retirement communities and senior housing, and I know so many older and younger people who want to live in an age integrated environment, but it's pretty tough to do that, to find opportunities. So I'd like us to be as creative around bringing people together across age as we've been in splitting them apart. And that's really where I'm very much obsessed. And maybe to come closer to answering the question is, one of the areas I'm interested in doing that is music, because I think that's a kind of zeitgeist moment, right? Whether it's Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga, or Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs at the Grammys, or Brandi Carlisle and Joni Mitchell. One after another, there are these incredible examples of music where older and younger people are coming together in a way that I think really shows what the combination of generations can produce that neither can do on their end. So we're thinking about starting a new program called Generations Got Talent, where we have older younger duets competing with each other in all genres. That's a way of getting a little more creativity into things.
Yeah.
And I think music is the place where we often imagine a lot of segregation, right? That one generation likes one particular kind of music, another likes a different kind. So what a beautiful third way forward to find that spark. I love that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you can reflect with us about an experience you've had in your career, a moment in your professional life that was really hard, but out of that grew something that was good.
I feel like that I have a lot of examples to choose from. It's a rich soil. The one that comes to mind, I think, in the context of this 30th anniversary of Experience Corps last week, is that program was designed to reform a federal service program called the Senior Corps that had been around since the War on Poverty, since 1965. And when we piloted the program, all the funding came from this federal agency that runs the Senior Corps. It's now been renamed AmeriCorps Seniors. And all 5 of the initial Experience Corps projects were Senior Corps programs. And that went extremely well. And the idea was to modernize this program so that the Senior Corps would become Experience Corps. That would be a 21st century. And what happened is that after the program was so successful and had all this research evidence, instead of embracing the program, the directors of the Senior Corps around the country rose up and killed it. They killed all funding for the program. And it reminded me that, that adage, the great enemy of reform is the last generation of reform. And similar things have happened around Head Start. And I was crushed because I'm remain to this day an enormous fan of these Senior Corps programs, foster grandparents, RSVP, senior companion program. They're brilliant. And so I didn't see this coming. And it did force us to reimagine the future of Experience Corps, not as a model for updating and reforming these programs with ideas that had come from the Senior Corps directors themselves, but as an independent program. And that was, brought with it a whole set of challenges. In fact, it was close to going out of existence because there was no steady funding stream, and AARP adopted it and has run it ever since and put tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars into it. That was another, kind of out of the blue salvation. And so I'm not sure what would have happened to this program if AARP hadn't come to the rescue. So, things did not go as planned.
Yeah.
One final thing, and it's just like a fun, silly question that we like to ask folks is, what is one job out there that you're fully unqualified to do that you wish you could do?
It would be as a lighting designer.
Oh,
I love that. I've never heard that before.
My wife went from she has a master's in public health. She went from being a caregiving expert working for an NGO to being a garden designer. I go into community college, and it's totally transformed her life. And my whole life I've been really interested in lighting and architecture, and I know nothing about it. And I suspect I would have very little aptitude for it, but I would be proud to tell somebody at a dinner party that that's what I do.
Oh,
That's so great.
I love that. Dana, while we interviewed Marc, at one point he shared,
I guess I really believe in the twists and turns, not just of careers, but people want to look back and see this kind of rational, linear picture, but in fact, things are much messier.
Yeah, that's precisely what this podcast is about. Our nonlinear, messy pathways filled with twists and turns.
And what Marc has dedicated his life to is the cultivation of social capital, which is the value in our networks and our ability to access and use it. Did you know, Dana, that we're more likely to get a job through a weak tie or people who are acquaintances rather than close friends?
I would have thought we would be better off getting connections through our closest friends.
Yeah, it's surprising, but the people who know us the best, our strong ties, often have a fair amount of overlap with our existing professional networks. But if we work with the weaker ties, they expand our reach beyond our networks, giving us access to new opportunities and untapped connections.
Interesting. By fostering these intergenerational and mentoring relationships, Marc's work strengthens people's social capital and their ability to have real choices and mobility in their careers. There's a Wendell Berry quote that Marc references that I really loved and wanted to reference again as we conclude this episode. The quote goes like this: "We all come from divorce. This is an age of divorce. Things that belong together have been taken apart, and you can't put it all back together again. What you can do is the only thing that you can do. You can take two things that ought to be together, and you could put them together. Two things, not all things." I love that quote. And in a way, that's exactly what mentorship does. It reconnects things that have been separated.
I love that. Modern society has created so much fragmentation between generations, between knowledge and practice, between individuals and communities. But as Marc and Wendell Berry remind us, we can focus on what we can do. Take two things that belong together and put them back together. That's the power of mentorship. And that's what we can all do in our own small ways.
Exactly. She's Michelle Weiss.
And she's Dana Allen Walsh.
This has been another episode of A Life Worth Working.
Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends and loved ones who may also be searching for purpose and meaning in their work lives, or what we call the soul of work.